Have you ever heard a word and it just feels like shrouded in mystery? Like Sufism. I feel that way about Sufism.
Yeah.
And today we are diving deep into these excerpts from Sufism.pdf to unpack it all.
Okay.
Because there's this preconception that it's like separate from Islam.
Right.
Almost like its own religion.
Yeah, it's a common misunderstanding, unfortunately. People imagine some kind of esoteric offshoot, but really, Sufism it's intertwined with Islam.
So instead of picturing like a separate branch, how should we be understanding it then?
Think of it as like a path within Islam, a way of experiencing and connecting with the faith on a deeper, a more spiritual level.
A path leading where, though? What's the ultimate destination on this journey?
So at its core, Sufism is about spiritual purification,
Okay.
a continuous striving for closeness to God. And this process of purification, we call this tazkiyah.
Tazkiyah. It sounds like hitting the reset button on your soul.
Yeah.
Like getting back to some kind of original state. Am I on the right track?
Yeah, you're exactly on the right track. And it really relates directly to the concept of fitra in Islamic theology.
Okay.
Which is that primordial state of purity that we're born with. But, life, with all its complexities and distractions, it can sometimes veil that innate purity.
Like a mirror. It's like a mirror and it gets dusty. You got to polish it up to see clearly.
Exactly. Yeah. Sufism gives us the practices and the principles to help us clear away that dust, to polish our hearts so they can reflect the divine light more clearly.
I love that.
And it emphasizes that this potential for spiritual growth, it's within every single Muslim, like a seed just waiting for the right conditions to sprout.
Okay, that analogy really helps it click for me. So there's no special initiation or ritual to kind of awaken this potential?
It's not about like inventing something new, but rather nurturing something that's already there. Sufism just provides the tools and the guidance to help that seed within you grow.
Fascinating. And you mentioned earlier that there's this misconception of Sufism being a latecomer to Islam.
Right.
But if it's about nurturing something so fundamental, it couldn't have just appeared out of nowhere.
Exactly.
So what's the real story? Take us back to the beginning.
So the roots of Sufism go way, way back, further than many people realize. And they trace really right back to the time of the Prophet Muhammad himself.
Wow. So if it's that old, why all the confusion and debate about its place in Islam?
Part of it might be because the term Sufism itself has a bit of a murky origin story.
Okay, now you've got me really curious.
Yeah.
What's murky about it?
So the most accepted theory is that Sufism comes from the word suf, which means wool.
Wool, like the material.
Precisely, like the material. And it's thought that early Sufis were known for wearing, simple woolen garments as the sign of their humility.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And their focus on the spiritual over the material.
Exactly. Wool being practical, unadorned.
It's not a flashy status symbol.
Exactly, not at all. Though there is an alternate theory linking it to the Arabic word for purity, safa. But regardless of which linguistic route you favor, the core point is that these early individuals weren't inventing something new or outside of Islamic tradition. They were embodying its essence from the very start.
So who were these figures in the very earliest days? Those who planted the seeds for what would become Sufism.
So even before the term Sufi was coined, there were individuals kind of embodying this spirit, One such figure was Abu Dhar al-Ghifari. He was a close companion of the Prophet, known for his simple living and deep devotion.
We're already seeing those core Sufi-like qualities kind of shining through.
Right.
So how do we get from these early individuals to a more formalized movement?
So as we move along the timeline, we encounter this pivotal figure, Hassan al-Basri, who lived in the late 7th and early 8th centuries.
Okay.
And he was troubled by the increasing materialism and worldly distractions he saw creeping into Muslim society.
Sounds very familiar. Even centuries later, the struggle to stay grounded amidst life's distractions is real.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. He was a man ahead of his time, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Hassan al-Basri emphasized purifying the heart, turning inward to find true contentment rather than chasing, outward markers of success.
Yeah.
And his teachings, they had a huge impact, and they're still considered foundational to Sufi thought today.
It's incredible how these voices from centuries ago can still resonate so powerfully in our modern lives.
It's timeless. Their message is timeless. Because the human condition hasn't really changed all that much. We still yearn for that connection for something deeper.
Yeah.
And this is where you start to see the more structured side of Sufism taking shape with the formation of Sufi orders known as tariqas.
Okay, let's unpack this term tariqas. Are we talking about organized groups now?
Yes, but these groups weren't simply united by, shared ideas. They formed around a revered teacher, a guide, known as a sheikh.
So it was about a direct connection to a teacher.
Yes.
A lineage of knowledge.
Absolutely. The sheikh wasn't teaching in isolation. They were part of an unbroken chain of transmission, a spiritual lineage going all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad himself.
Wow, that creates such a powerful sense of connection to the very roots of the faith.
Exactly. And to formally become part of a tariqa, you would make a pledge of allegiance, a bayah, to the sheikh, signifying your commitment to following their guidance on this spiritual path.
It's like saying, I'm ready, guide me, I trust in this lineage and its wisdom.
Yes, and it wasn't just a pledge to the sheikh, like as an individual, but to the entire chain of teachers stretching back to the Prophet.
There's so much power in that lineage, like knowing you're part of something so much bigger than yourself. It makes me wonder, though, how did this lineage actually play out in daily life?
Yeah.
What did the inward journey of Sufism look like in practice?
That's where things get really fascinating.
So we've got this image of a spiritual path,
right?
A lineage, going all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad. But what did the travelers on this path actually do?
Yeah.
How did they live out their Sufism?
That's where the real beauty of Sufism kind of comes alive. It's in the practices that are designed to cultivate that inner connection with the divine. Now, it's important to remember that within Sufism, you have like a rich tapestry of different orders, each with its own kind of unique flavor and customs.
It's like variations on a theme,
You've
right?
got it. You've got it. And Sufism isn't about rejecting the outward practices of Islam, like the 5 pillars.
Right.
It's about going deeper.
Okay.
Enriching those practices with inner experience and awareness.
Adding layers of meaning.
Yeah.
Deepening the connection.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And one of the most fundamental practices in Sufism is
Dhikr. That rings a bell. It's about remembering God, right?
Exactly. Remembering God. And it involves the repetition of specific phrases or names of God, sometimes silently, sometimes aloud, as a way to cultivate this constant awareness of the divine presence.
It makes me think of mindfulness practices, which are so popular these days.
Yeah.
That quieting the mind, focusing on the present moment. Is there a connection there?
There's a lot of overlap.
Okay.
A lot of overlap.
Yeah.
Both dhikr and mindfulness are about moving beyond that constant chatter of the mind.
Yeah.
Creating space for a deeper connection to something beyond ourselves.
I can see how that would be so grounding, especially in our modern world, where distractions are constantly vying for our attention.
For sure.
So dhikr is about remembrance. What other practices help Sufis on that inward journey?
Another key practice is muraqabah, which translates to watchfulness or meditation.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. Meditation within Islam. Tell me more.
Yeah, so muraqabah is about cultivating a state of deep presence, of being fully present in each moment, aware of your thoughts, your actions, your intentions. It's almost like you become an observer of yourself in a way.
So it's not just about emptying your mind,
right,
but about kind of actively engaging with your inner world in relation to God.
You got it. And there's a beautiful hadith, a saying of the Prophet Muhammad that really captures this essence of muraqabah beautifully. He said, "Worship God as though you see him, and if you do not see him, then know that he sees you."
Wow. To carry that awareness throughout your day, to act as though you're always in the presence of the divine.
Power.
That's powerful stuff.
It really is. It adds whole new dimension to prayer and worship, doesn't it? It's about bringing that sense of awareness, of presence, into every aspect of life.
Now, I can't talk about Sufi practices without mentioning the whirling dervishes.
Of course.
Such a captivating image.
Oh, it's definitely visually striking.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that the whirling, while iconic, is specific to the Mevlevi order.
Okay.
Which was founded by the famous 13th century poet Rumi.
Rumi.
Yes.
His poetry seems to be everywhere these days.
His words have this incredible ability to transcend time and cultures. They speak to something universal within us. But for the Mevlevis, the whirling isn't just a performance.
Right.
It's a form of active meditation, a way to connect with the divine through movement, to shed the ego and experience this sense of spiritual transcendence.
It's amazing how these practices so seamlessly blend the physical and spiritual realms.
And speaking of blending, the role of music in Sufism adds yet another dimension to this path, though it's not without its complexities.
What do you mean? What makes music in Sufism so complex?
Well, within Islam, there are, differing opinions regarding the permissibility of music, with some viewing it as a distraction from worship, while others embrace its power to uplift the soul.
So where do Sufis stand on this spectrum?
It really depends, to be honest. It depends on the specific order and their lineage.
Okay.
Some are stricter, while others have incorporated music into their spiritual practices, for centuries.
I imagine the way that music can evoke such powerful emotions.
Right.
It would make sense to harness that.
Yeah.
Like a spiritual practice.
Exactly. It can be a bridge. It can be a bridge to a deeper connection with the divine. And a great example of this is Qawwali music, which has deep roots in Sufism, especially in South Asia.
Qawwali, I've heard that before. It's incredibly passionate and soulful.
It is. And it's often performed at Sufi shrines, with those intricate melodies and rhythmic intensity, and lyrics that often express a deep longing for union with God.
It's fascinating how these different forms of expression, movement, music, poetry can all be channels to connect with something larger than ourselves.
It's beautiful.
And speaking of connection, we touched earlier on the importance of saints in Sufism.
Right.
Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. Saints, they hold a special place, really, in the hearts of many Sufis. They're not seen as just like historical figures,
Right.
but as embodiments of spiritual ideals.
Okay.
Individuals who attained a profound closeness with God.
So they're like guides showing what's possible on this Sufi path.
Precisely. They provide a tangible link, really, to that lineage we talked about.
Okay.
Demonstrating the transformative power of following this path. And this reverence for saints often manifests in the practice of visiting their tombs.
Tomb visitation is a common practice in Sufism.
It is. It's especially prevalent in South Asia.
Okay.
Where you'll find these elaborate shrines dedicated to Sufi saints. And people visit to pay their respects, to seek blessings, to feel a connection to that lineage.
It's like those physical spaces become imbued with the energy and then the wisdom of those who came before.
You got it.
It's making me want to hear more about some of these impactful figures. Like, who are they?
Well, there are so many fascinating Sufi saints throughout history. But to give you a taste, let's start with Rabia al-Adawiya.
Okay.
A female mystic who lived in 8th century Iraq.
A female mystic in that era. I know.
Remarkable.
She was a true pioneer. Rabia's teachings emphasize the pure, unconditional love of God.
Okay.
Free from any desire for reward or fear of punishment.
That kind of radical love and devotion is incredibly inspiring.
Yeah.
I'm betting she had some powerful things to say about this. She did. One of her most famous sayings is, "Oh God, if I worship you for fear of hell, burn me in hell. And if I worship you in hope of paradise, exclude me from paradise. But if I worship you for your own sake, then grudge me not your everlasting beauty."
Wow.
Yeah.
Talk about cutting to the heart of true devotion. That's powerful stuff.
Powerful. She was all about that direct, pure connection with the divine. Now we can't talk about Sufism without mentioning Rumi.
Rumi, the 13th century Persian poet whose words seem to have this timeless resonance. We already touched on his connection to the whirling dervishes, but what else makes him such a key figure in Sufism?
Rumi's poetry, it's just infused with this raw passion, this longing for the divine. It explores love, loss, the search for meaning, themes that really speak to something universal in the human experience.
Yeah.
No matter what background you come from, what century you're living in.
It's incredible how his words can still feel so relevant
I know.
and relatable after all this time.
That's the power of tapping into those, core human longings for connection.
Yeah.
For transcendence. And speaking of someone who bridged worlds, we can't forget Al-Ghazali.
Okay.
Now, he was a towering figure in Islamic thought, scholar, theologian, mystic, who really shaped the way that we understand Sufism even today.
Ghazali, he's considered one of the giants of Islamic history.
A polymath, mastered so many disciplines.
Yeah.
But it was his deep exploration of Sufism that really had a profound impact. showing how those personal mystical experiences could actually deepen your understanding of Islamic teachings.
So he helped create a bridge between the intellectual and the experiential aspects of faith.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. He provided a framework to understand and integrate these seemingly disparate realms.
Okay. We've covered so much ground.
I know, right?
From the historical roots to these amazing practices and the figures who brought them to life. It makes me wonder, where does Sufism stand today?
Yeah, it's almost like we've been on our own Deeker journey.
Right.
This remembering, this reflecting on the lineage of Sufism.
Yes.
But now I'm really curious, what's its place in our modern world?
That's a question with, unfortunately, a complicated answer.
Okay.
While Sufism has profoundly enriched Islamic tradition,
Yeah.
it doesn't always get the recognition, or even the respect it deserves, frankly.
You mean it's still misunderstood?
Sadly, yes.
Even after all this time. In some parts of the Muslim world, Sufism faces resistance, even outright persecution.
I'm surprised to hear that. Why would a spiritual tradition focused on, inner peace and connecting with God be met with such hostility?
Well, it often comes down to differing interpretations of Islam.
Okay.
Certain groups, often with more fundamentalist viewpoints, they're suspicious of some Sufi practices.
What kinds of practices are we talking about? What's causing the controversy?
So for some, the veneration of saints,
Okay.
the visiting of their tombs, this raises concerns about idolatry, about blurring the lines between reverence and worship.
That makes sense, yeah. It's a fine line to walk.
Exactly. And practices like Sufi whirling, the use of music in spiritual gatherings, these can also be seen as innovations that have no basis in the earliest days of Islam.
So it's a clash of perspectives, really, on how to approach and express faith.
Yes, and tragically, this clash can sometimes erupt into violence. There have been attacks on Sufi mosques and shrines, which is heartbreaking to witness.
It reminds us that even in the pursuit of something as pure as connection with the divine, there can be conflict and intolerance.
It's true. One particularly devastating attack was in 2017 at a Sufi mosque in Egypt, resulted in a horrific loss of life. It's a stark reminder that the Sufi emphasis on tolerance, compassion, and peace is needed now more than ever.
I've noticed that some governments, often those with complicated relationships with Islam in general, seem to view Sufism more favorably.
Right.
Why is that?
It's an interesting dynamic, isn't it? Countries like China and Russia, for example, they tend to see Sufism as a more moderate, less politically charged expression of Islam.
So they see it as less of a threat.
In a way, yes. In a way, yes. They believe that Sufism can act as a counterbalance to more, radical ideologies that they perceive as destabilizing. It's a complex situation, with Sufism caught in the middle.
It's almost ironic being seen as both, not Islamic enough
Right.
by some,
Right.
and the, preferred version of Islam by others. Despite these challenges, it sounds like Sufism still thrives in many parts of the world.
Absolutely. It continues to attract people from all walks of life, offering a path that emphasizes inner transformation, love, and a direct experience of the divine.
So for our listener who's been on this deep dive with us, exploring the intricacies of Sufism, what would you say is the key takeaway, the thing they should carry with them?
I think the key takeaway is that Sufism reminds us that the journey of faith is deeply, deeply personal. It's an inward journey of self-discovery and connection with something larger than ourselves. It encourages us to look beyond, dogma.
Yeah.
And external rituals, to find that divine spark within.
It's about recognizing that seed of potential we talked about earlier.
Exactly.
That innate capacity for spiritual growth that we all possess.
Yes, yes. And within Sufism, you have this rich tapestry of practices, of poetry, of music, of inspiring figures, all pointing towards that inward journey.
This deep dive has been incredible. I feel like we've just barely scratched the surface of this fascinating world.
There's always more to explore.
I know. For our listeners, we always want to leave you with something to think about. So, to our listeners, read Rumi's poetry. Lose yourself in the sounds of qawwali music. Delve deeper into the teachings of any figures who particularly resonated with you. Sufism offers a path for anyone seeking a more meaningful connection with the divine, a path to cultivate inner peace and find beauty in our often chaotic world. And really, it's